This is a question. Isn't it a misconception that alphabetic script is easier to learn than logographic script? I have that question for many years in my mind, but since I'm trying to understand the Vietnamese writing, it has become very topical. My name is Robbie. I'm a cultural promoter. Today I'm working for Vietnam Cultural Exchange, and for the past 50 years my work consisted of developing and creating educational projects and intercultural exhibitions in Europe and Asia. Since my retirement I have been active in Vietnam. Among other things, I was the first director of the largest Vietnamese terracotta park and museum near Hoi An. And now my throat is a little bit raspy, so sorry. Vietnam has a fascinating past. The history of terracotta alone goes back thousands of years. But what makes Vietnam completely unique is that for a few thousand years they used the logographic script, which was obliged by the occupying northern neighbors. But about 100 years ago, the current alphabetic script was made mandatory by the occupying French. Point is that alphabetic script, which is based on sound communication, is very different with logographic script, which is based on visual communication. Normally this difference is not so clear, but it is in Vietnam. Vietnamese therefore offers a unique opportunity to investigate this, and that has kept me busy for years. In order to compare the two scripts, we need to have a good idea of them, and I have noticed that it's always said that learning the logographic script is so much more difficult than learning the alphabetic script. That has been said for centuries, so it must be true. And any linguist will be able to explain to you why it is so. However, I did not study linguistics, but educational science, and so unhindered by linguistics, I simply look at it from the question, is it really more difficult to learn it? So I first heard about the script they used in China when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I thought it was great that those people, even though they didn't understand each other, used the same script and could therefore communicate with each other. However, like other Europeans, I started with learning the alphabetic script. And even today, whoever asks on the internet whether the logographic script is easy to learn still reads that it's very, very difficult because the characters are complex and you have to know a few thousand characters. And that should be the main reason why the logographic script will be more difficult than the alphabetic script. Well, it seems very valid argument, but is it so? I don't think so. It is said that some characters are so complex with so many strokes and you have to know a few thousand characters to read a newspaper, for example. Yeah, but a character is comparable to a word, and to read an English newspaper you have to know about 8,000 words, significantly more than the 3,000 you need when it would have been written with characters. And are English words so simple? How about words as or ewawe or fluchinausiphiliphiligation, something like that. Those are real English words, and there are many more long and complicated words. So when we just take a look at the word difficult to write, this with a Chinese character, we have to paint the following strokes as we can see on the purple culture net. We see that it is written with 10 strokes. In English it is written with 9 letters. However, those letters also have parts, and when we count them we come to 16 lines that have to be written. We are used to see a letter as one figure, but several of them are built up with 2 or more parts, and we have been learning to combine the right part because a D isn't a B or a P or a Q. This is just an example. For other words it will be the other way around. But there is much more. Suppose that you are living in Europe and you want to introduce yourself to a few people spread from the north to the south of Europe. For let's say, these 5 countries you need to know 13 different words for the simple sentence, my name is Robbie, because they all have a different language. We start in the north and then go to the south, and this is what we might have to write. Ja, ik heet Robbie. Or, ik heet Robbie. Ah, je m'appelle Robbie. Or, mijn naam is Robbie. If you do the same in China, where everyone has also the same different languages, you only need to write those 5 characters and they all understand it. So if we now look at a normal daily use, we need about 600 characters. To be able to write the same in English, you need about 1,000 words. And a Frenchman understands very little of that. So to be able to write the same in those 5 different European languages, you need to know about 5,000 words. Will those 600 characters be harder to learn than those 5,000 words? Or can you only compare with a single alphabetic language? But even then. So the question is, how did people came to the conclusion that alphabetic script is easier to learn than logographic script? In my opinion, there are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, a lack of understanding of a technical invention. Secondly, that in linguistic science, script is seen as a written spoken language and not as an independent written language. Let us start with the origin of the misconception. Therefore, we have to go back to Gutenberg's inventing of the printed with individual letters. To make this clear, we need to take a look of how words and how comparable characters are written and printed. Words are written by placing the letters one after the other in a line until the word is formed. The meaning of the word is determined by the order and which letters we use. For characters, you do not use letters but strokes, and they are not placed one after the other, but in a line, but in a square, one after the other in a specific order. So for handwriting, there was no really much difference. Learning to write letters is comparable to learning to draw strokes. You have to make the correct selection of both letters and strokes, and the order of the letters seems to me just as difficult as the position of the strokes. And for the same text, you need more words than characters. In China, they already knew printing. In the beginning, they cut a whole page out of a wooden block. They had to print a page by page. A printing press, it looks like this. Today, artists like Michel Newland are using the same printing technique for their artwork, but they have a modern iron press, and it goes like this. The problem with printing a whole page was that if they made a mistake, they had to cut the whole block again. That's why they started making separate characters and put them together to make a page, and that was then printed. But still, each character had to be cut in a wooden block. If a book of many pages had 1,000 of different characters, then they all had to be cut separately. So a printing company had thousands of wooden character blocks in stock, and cutting out those characters was a lot of work. For the alphabetic manuscript, one could also cut a whole page into a wooden block and then print it, but Gutenberg then realized that it was much more efficient and economical to work with individual letters. A series of letters can be very easily be clamped together to form a word, and those words could be clamped together to a page. And when Gutenberg had printed a page, after the printing he could break the page into separate letters and use those letters again for the next page. In the past, as I worked as a typesetter, and when we had to set a whole page with loose letters, it was a lot of work. In fact, much more than making a page with character blocks. So the profit was neither in the setting of the page nor in the printing of it, but in the design and making of the letters. With one letter set, Gutenberg could make thousands of words, while the Chinese had to cut for each character a special wood block. This saved a huge amount of time and work and material, and so Gutenberg's invention was gigantic. What it meant was that for printing alphabetic script, one only needs one letter set with 26 letters and a few other things like punctuation marks. But with that set, one can make all words, while for printing a character script, one needs a wood block for each character. If a text has 1,000 different words, one still needs only one set of 26 letters, while one needs 1,000 different wood blocks. Because most people do not really know how printing works, what I mainly understood was that for an alphabetical text you only need a limited number of letters, while many characters are needed for the same text in logographic writing. And a misunderstanding was born. It is basically comparing apples with oranges, because a letter is not the same as a character. The printing was in fact the same work, and whether one have to know how to write and to understand the text written with 1,000 alphabetic words or with 1,000 logographic characters, there's no difference. The text have the same content. Unfortunately, thanks to the literary studies, this misunderstanding has crystallized further and the apples have become even more beautiful. The cause is not so difficult to find. Language is primarily understood as a spoken language, and writing is completely subordinate to that. There are languages that do not have a written version, but in the past there were no written language that do not have a spoken version. This was the case when linguistics developed. Although in the meantime, sign language and computer language has been added, and they do not use sound. Nevertheless, that relationship with sound remains essential for linguistics. And it is that relationship that makes the apples more beautiful than the orange. For linguistics, the smallest part of a language is the smallest sound part. Alphabets use graphemes, called letters, that correspond then to spoken phonemes. Those are the smallest sound units of the alphabetic language. The smallest part of a logogram is the stroke, but a stroke has no further meaning nor a sound relationship. So the stroke is disregarded from the linguistic point of view when judging what the smallest sound unit of the logographic script is. That is why the logogram itself, the character being the morpheme, is considered the smallest sound unit. If one then compares those smallest sound units, it's correctly that the alphabets generally use fewer than 100 symbols, while syllables and logographics use hundreds of thousands of them. However, what one should not do, in my opinion, is draw the conclusion that the alphabetic script is therefore easier to learn than the logographic script. An English text of 100 alphabetic words can be just as difficult to understand as when one uses characters for the same content. That simply doesn't matter. Furthermore, it's unclear what one means by learning. Anyone who learns to write Chinese can communicate on a basic level with users of different languages. Anyone who uses alphabetic script must learn the script for each language. And so many more aspects. Alphabetic languages are auditory. We use different parts of our brains for them than we use for a visually based logographic script. For one person, one system will be easier, and for the other system. While there is also a big difference between how we process and use auditory information and what we do with visual information. To get a good impression of the difference, show a group a picture of a child crying, and they will feel sorry for that child and be concerned. And let another group hear a child crying. They will immediately react, and at least a few will stand up to find out what is going on. We process auditory and visual information differently, and it's very interesting to investigate the difference, but to give already a valid judgment about it, I find very premature. How we process information and what the consequences this has in the long term has not been sufficiently investigated. For the alphabetic script, we also use visual information. Each alphabetic script uses different signs. For English and Vietnamese we use the Latin script, but in a very different way. As for some languages there is a direct relationship between the sign and the sound. For other languages there is not, and it's very confusing that there is no obvious logic why, for example, words are written the same but pronounced differently. For my mother tongue, the no longer spoken Old Flemish, I know from experience how illogical alphabetic languages can be. For example, the word for to buy was kopen. In my mother tongue we wrote two O's because we say two O's. But in a new language that was introduced when I was about 5 years old, that was a bit similar to Dutch, we had to write kopen with only one O. But if you only want to pronounce one O, you have to write koppen with two P's. I have never understood the logic of this. Vietnamese writing also has illogical situations. For example, you write the word for down, xuống, with the yao sak, a rising tone indication, while we actually have to go down. This is typical due to the history of the Vietnamese writing, because for logographic writing the pronunciation isn't related to the writing. An interesting difference is the use of tones. For languages based on logographic writing, they only have a vocabulary meaning. In the very past there weren't so many of them, but when they start to merge more and more local languages, they got so many words. To distinguish the meaning of them, the use of the tones increased a lot. Tones have no melodic relation with the rest of the sentence, and logographic writing with this one syllable word is also not very rhythmic. Sound-based languages are melodic and rhythmic, and they also use a lot of tones, but in a much more complex way. The difference between the spoken version of an alphabetic script and a logographic script is also clear from a very recent research. Do some languages sound more beautiful than others? It's published by the University of California. We can read a conclusion that even users of tonal language do not find other tonal languages sounding melodic and nice. The use of tones make a language less melodic and also less logic compared to alphabetic languages. Lucky, the logographic writing has several other positive aspects. But merging the different dialects while preserving as many words as possible has not made logographic writing any easier to learn. But has it become more difficult compared to English, for example? Well, it must be about the same time that we had in Asia the merging that we had in England from the 15th century to the 18th century, the great vowel shift. What happened was that during this period people started to pronounce several sounds at a higher pitch. This with the result that several words that were spoken low became spoken higher, and after a while they did sound as the words that already had that pitch. That is why some words with a different meaning and a different writing are pronounced exactly the same. In this way, every spelling and language has developed its own difficulties over the years. This does not alter the fact that if we only look at the spelling and the principle of how the spoken language is written down, taking into account that the same logographic script can be used for multiple languages, the argument that the alphabetic script is easier to learn than the logographic script is not based on facts. It's just a different way of writing and reading, and you have to get used to it at a young age. That is why it seemed to me that it will be incredibly useful if very young people everywhere should learn the logographic script as a second script. I think to develop this visual ability can be very useful for much more than only writing. Thank you for watching, and see you maybe in the Art for Children gallery in the future. Bye bye.